Theodore Dreiser was intimately familiar with both Chicago and New York, the settings for his novel Sister Carrie. Though born in Indiana into a poor Catholic home vibrating with 3 boys and 4 girls, he left for Chicago when he was 16 to escape the poor farm on which his family resided. His sister, Emma, whose vexed life was the model for Carrie Meeber, was already living in Chicago, where she engaged in a fairly disreputable life, having numerous affairs. Regardless, once arrived, Dreiser grew infatuated with city life. He was excited by the bustling traffic on the sidewalks and streets. He enjoyed the marquees over theaters, the noise inside and outside restaurants, the music from stage productions, and of course, the naive belief that he could earn enough to shake the dispiriting existence he had been enduring. He failed in this ambition, however. Good jobs, as he soon learned, were not plentiful in Chicago. Here, some context will be helpful. The late 19th century was the Gilded Age in America, when a few men made vast fortunes from the tremendous growth of industrial enterprises. The glitter associated with the age was a sham of sorts, however. Beneath the few stories of stupendous fortunes lay the 60-hour-plus work weeks of men and women who labored at a grinding pace in dangerous factories day after sweat-filled day for miserable wages. The factories Chicago became most known for were its meatpacking factories, earning it the nickname Hog Butcher to the world. Pulling from the livestock of the surrounding countryside, the factories often had workers repeat a single monotonous aspect of slaughtering, cleaning, or packaging meat, in a process that would directly inspire Henry Ford's approach to industrial assembly. For many workers in the factories and elsewhere, earnings barely kept pace with their expenses. In 1891, for example, the monthly expenses of one family, a laborer, his wife, and a child, totaled $28.01 for food, rents, and other necessities. His monthly income was $23.67. Yet, even if it was unkind to many of its inhabitants, Chicago had been growing exponentially for decades, and would continue to do so. Why? First, you have to remember that in 1825 the Erie Canal was completed. It is a waterway in New York that runs about 363 miles from Albany on the Hudson River to Buffalo at Lake Erie, completing a navigable water route from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. This meant that goods from the center of the continent, crops, meat, timber, no longer had to be sent down the Mississippi to New Orleans and beyond. Instead, materials could be sent directly to New York City, where they could be speedily exported to Europe and elsewhere. Chicago became the major gathering place for these goods, largely because some of Chicago's businessmen who connived to have the country's railroad system focus on Chicago. Consider the growth of the city in 1850, 1860, and 1870, just before the Great Chicago Fire hit in 1871. This growth was made possible only by virtue of Chicago's place in the railroad lines. The incredible, vast railway system was, in the East at least, constructed by mostly Irish immigrants. Railroad work is incredibly hard, and the system became crucial to the prosperity of Chicago and the United States more generally, yet the Irish immigrants who worked on it were treated horribly by the native population. Few Americans realized that, in the 19th century, the Irish were perceived to be non-white and subhuman. The wealthy and middle-class Americans sought to distance themselves from these immigrants. Cities always involve conflicts of proximity. As the Irish settled in lands around the railroad, they were led ever closer to the very neighborhoods in which the city's wealthiest citizens lived. On October 8, 1871, a fire started in a barn owned by Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. Winds picked up, and as most of the city was made of wood, the fire spread rapidly. Eventually, the fire reached the central business district, where it destroyed hotels, department stores, Chicago City Hall, the Opera House, and theaters, churches, and printing plants. The fire finally burned itself out, aided by diminishing winds and a light drizzle that began falling late on Monday night. Once the fire had ended, the smoldering remains were still too hot for a survey of the damage to be completed for days. Eventually, it was determined that the fire destroyed an area about 4 miles long, encompassing more than 2,000 acres. It destroyed more than 73 miles of roads, 120 miles of sidewalks, 2,000 lampposts, 17,000 buildings, and over $200 million in property, about a third of the city's valuation. Of the 300,000 inhabitants, 90,000 were left homeless. Yet in subsequent decades, a rebuilt Chicago rose dramatically from the ashes. In 1890, when the novel begins, the territorial confines of Chicago stretched to 165 square miles. Infrastructure and industry guaranteed that it would grow even more in the decades to follow. As industries continued to grow, young men and women poured into Chicago and other major cities from rural communities across the Midwest, hoping to earn their fortunes. The railroads provided the major impetus for growth. In 1860, there were only 60,000 miles of track in the United States, but by 1900 that figure had multiplied to 250,000, leaving hardly a single major community outside the railroad system. Supporting the rise of industry was an increase in non-agricultural jobs. About 4.6 million Americans worked in factories, and 3 million in construction and transportation by the end of the century. The industrial workforce was fed by a steady stream of immigration, which brought 5 million people to the United States between 1880 and 1890 alone. Meanwhile, there was a major internal migration of workers from rural areas to urban centers. By 1920, nearly half of the population in the United States was living in cities. The main attraction of the cities was employment. Chicago was a home to many large enterprises, including major weaving and cloth production facilities, an enormous meatpacking industry, and countless clothing and shoe factories. Dreiser's interest in this rapid growth is presented in one of Sister Carrie's early chapters. Dreiser had come to Chicago in circumstances very similar to Carrie's, seeking work at a variety of industries, all with limited success. His intimate familiarity with Chicago's commercial workings and his own problems finding employment there most certainly influenced his use of the city as the setting for Carrie's early failures and feelings of alienation and desperation. The second half of the novel takes place in New York City, where Dreiser's career as a journalist and writer eventually took him. Unlike Chicago, New York City was established as a major trading post not in the mid-19th century, but more than 200 years before, in 1609, when Englishman Henry Hudson sailed through the Narrows into Upper New York Bay. Hudson was looking for a westerly passage to Asia and never found one, but he did make note of the abundant beaver population. Beaver pelts were in fashion in Europe, and Hudson's report of the beaver population in the New York area served as the impetus for the founding of Dutch trading colonies in the New World, among them New Amsterdam, which would become New York City. Over the next 250 years, the city became the most populous and richest city in America, the place where the goods of the New World made their way to the Old World, and vice versa. This process made some very rich indeed, and this wealth could be seen in the splendid architecture of the city. The city planners developed an expanded city grid that encompassed all Manhattan, and the old merchant aristocracy pressed for a central park, which was opened to a design competition in 1857. It would become the first landscape park in an American city. New York came to boast signs of incredible prosperity, gorgeous, tall edifices, numerous theaters and places of entertainment, a complex public transit system, and numerous bridges. In many ways, however, places like Central Park and the incredibly wealthy neighborhoods that surrounded it to the east and west represented a counterpoint to the much poorer neighborhoods of the South. As in other American cities during this period, enormous gulfs in income and wealth existed side by side. In the neighborhoods closer to the docks lived thousands of immigrants from regions far and wide. While many of these immigrants were Irish, as was the case in Chicago, New York was a true world city even in these years. Life here, however, was in sharp contrast to life for the merchant aristocracy. Another journalist of the period, Jacob Riis, a Dutch immigrant himself, documented the squalid living conditions common in these neighborhoods in his famous book, How the Other Half Live. Riis had been a reporter in these areas for many years before he wrote this book, and his articles were always quite open about his sympathies for the poor. One day, in 1888, he read of the use of flash powder to take night pictures, and within weeks he was taking camera equipment into unlit tenement quarters and up foul alleyways at night, shooting pictures to portray the unsavory living conditions of the poor. Rees put the pictures to work without delay. Later he wrote, "I recall a midnight expedition to the Mulberry Bend with the sanitary police that had turned up a couple of characteristic cases of overcrowding. In one instance, 2 rooms that should, at most, have held 4 or 5 sleepers were found to contain 15, a week-old baby among them. Most of them were lodgers and slept there for 5 cents a spot. There was no pretense of beds." When the report was submitted to the health board the next day, it did not make much of an impression. These things rarely do, put in mere words, until my negatives, still dripping from the darkroom, came to reinforce them. From them there was no appeal. Neither the landlord's protest nor the tenant's plea went in the face of the camera's evidence, and I was satisfied. As we'll discuss in class, the life of the poor, understood in terms of environmental and biological influences, is a major theme of literary naturalism, the movement with which Dreiser is most closely associated. Dreiser's novel shows us this same aspect of city life, as well as the glitter and prosperity, the yearning for success that was on display elsewhere in the city.